Hi, Wayne. Hi, Wayne. Good Chodesh, everybody. Good Chodesh. Watch your step, Izzy. Yeah. Okay, so what we're up to is on Daf Yud Ches Amid Beis. We're in the middle of the page, and we were learning yesterday that you have to have special kavana um, when you're reciting the first pasuk of Shema, such that if a person was walking, he has to stand still for that first pasuk of Shema because it involves the acceptance of the yoke of heaven upon himself. So, in the same light of having proper kavana, Tane, we have a brisa that says, "Sarich laha'arich be'echad." A person has to elongate that the end of echad, and we'll see what exactly that means. But we all know what elongated echad sounds like because that's our common practice. Echad. Okay. The Gemara explains how Rav Nachman b'Rebbe Yaakov Amar uvilvad bidalis shel echad. He says, especially with the dalid of echad, because that's how and you should not elongate the ches, because and as the commentary says, she marich ba'os ches shebe'echad lifnei shesiyim es hamila ein adayin shum mashmos la'amira. So it's going to be difficult to understand the word echad that you're saying because you're elongated the ches. So it's better to elongate the word at the end. And the reason for the elongation is so that you can think about in your mind all of the things that you want to about accepting the yoke of heaven upon yourself. Like so sort of to indulge in that thought. Now, there's a lot more detail to discuss um, as far as how to elongate this word echad and what my thoughts are supposed to be, but we're going to put that aside for now. We'll take a look at the Shulchan Aruch maybe tomorrow. Okay, the the reward for elongating the echad, says the Gemara, Sumchus bar Yosef Omar, kol hamarich be'echad, ma'arichin lo yamav u'shenosav betova. Anyone who elongates the word echad in his Shema will have his days and his years elongated for goodness, meaning that um, accepting the yoke of heaven properly, when you say the Shema, is a skula for arichus yamim, is a way to prolong your life. Rabbi Yirmiyah Havamarich Sagin, Rabbi Yirmiyah was taking an especially long time to elongate his word echad, and Amarle Rabbi Zeira, leis at tzrich kol hachein. You're going a little bit too far. In other words, you don't need to go that far. Ela kadesha tamlichehu b'shamayim uva'aretz uva'arba ruchos ha'olam. All you need to do is declare him to be king in heaven and earth and in the four directions, northeast, south, and west. Now, as we'll see when we look at the poskim, each letter of the word echad implies something different. The aleph of echad, as you would imagine, reflects upon the unity of God, God's unity. The ches is reflective of a vertical crowning of God over all that is vertical ad infinitum, meaning the earth and the seven heavens adds up to 8. And the dalid of echad refers to the four directions horizontally, north, east, south, and west. So as we'll see from the poskim, when you say echad, that's what you're supposed to be thinking as you're accepting upon yourself God's mastery over yourself. I'm thinking echad, that Hashem is one. He's the king of the seven heavens and this earth, and that he is the king of all that exists all around me, north, east, south, and west, all four directions. So that's all that you have to be thinking about when you accept the yoke of heaven. You don't have to go into any deeper secret thoughts that apparently Rabbi Yirmiyah was going into. Rav, so now the Gemara is going to indicate to us how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, when he was giving shir, he had a bit of a dilemma because he would start giving shir before the Zman Kriya Shema, early in the morning, and he would give shir for a very long time. And sometimes the shir would go on for hours, and the Zman of Kriya Shema would elapse. So apparently the practice in Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's Beis Medrash was that they started shir before davening, just like we do, but instead of going the half hour or the 40 minutes or whatever it is, he went on for hours. And this would create a problem for the students who had not yet recited Kriya Shema, but presumably they were able to, because it was a big shir, each one would recite his own private Kriya Shema to himself. But the question is, what about Rebbe himself? What did he do about Kriya Shema? He starts before the Zman Kriya Shema starts, and what is he going to do? So Rav Sha'il Rebbe Chia Rabba, Velena Chame LaRebbe Mekabel Olav Ol Malchus Shammai. So Rav asked Rebbe Chia, the great Rebbe Chia, who was the premier Talmud of Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, he says, I haven't seen Rebbe accept the yoke of heaven upon himself. Meaning, the question that he had was, perhaps you could justify a person learning Torah, like we learned before, being exempt from all three paragraphs of Shema. You might even be able to say that he would be exempt from even the first paragraph of Shema. And you might even say that he's exempt from the first three psukim of Shema. But shouldn't every person, even someone who's engaged in Torah study, have an obligation to at least accept upon himself the yoke of heaven with the first pasuk of Shema, which, as we learned, contains the most important aspect of the Shema? So how come he doesn't even do that? So Amar Lei, Rabbi Chia said to him, "Hatechemine yohiv yodei ala he who mekabel alav ol malchus shamayim." He says, no, you see, Rebbe does it very surreptitiously, very privately, but you'll see at some point in the shir, he's going to put his hands over his face. He'll pause, he'll put his hand over his face. You think he's just trying to concentrate, but what he's really doing is he's saying the first pasuk of the Shema and covering his eyes. And that's his acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And he's Yotze with that. And we remember, we did learn previously in the first parak that there are opinions that say, even though we don't paskin this way, there are opinions that say that if a person is Toraso Umnaso, if a person's Torah study is their sole occupation, then they can exempt themselves from Kriya Shema. Some of the Meforshim learn that even if a person is Toraso Umnaso, he still has an obligation to recite Shema. But Rebbe was even more of an exclusive scholar because he was teaching, not only he was studying Torah, but he was teaching Torah to the masses. And therefore, he could justify being completely exempt from Shema. However, every Jew, no matter how important he is, has to accept upon himself the yoke of heaven every day. So that's why it was assumed that Rebbe would at least do that. And that's exactly what Reb Chia said to Rav. He said he is, but he's just doing it very, very privately. Amar Lei, so Rav said back to him, Ve'eno tzarech lahaskir yitzias Mitzrayim. So he says, but what about the daily commandment to remember the Exodus? Wouldn't Rebbe have to do that as well? Because that's also part of the mitzvah of reciting Kriya Shema. So Amar Lei, les efshir de lo yate milah. He says it's inevitable that Rebbe at some point in the course of the shir will talk about the Exodus. And I guarantee you, if you listen carefully, every day Rebbe in some way is making reference to Yitzias Mitzrayim. And in that way, he's being yotze, his biblical obligation, to remember the Exodus every day of your life. Because as we've mentioned before, there is a daily mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, of remembering the Exodus, because the Torah says, "L'man tizkor es yom tzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha," that you must remember the day you left Egypt all the days of your life. And that's why we say the third paragraph of Shema. Okay?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
but what about the passage where it says, Eric, the whole yom to me, on Reem? That applies to every Jew, right? That you have to say in the morning, you have to say at night.
Right.
There'd be no exemptions for anybody on that, even what we're talking about here.
Well, first of all, that's not a pasuk in the Torah. That's just part of our prayer, right? That we say.
But it's based on some, isn't it based on some?
Well, it's based on the biblical commandment to recite the Shema. But as we said, that someone who is Torasa Umnaso, someone whose Torah is his main occupation, can say that he's, like we learned before, he's osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. If I'm engaged in this mitzvah that is so monumentally important, I can exempt myself from other mitzvahs as well. And so apparently, even if you were going to argue it's a biblical mitzvah, a person could exempt himself by saying that he's engrossed in Torah study. But remember, we said it's a very rare breed of scholar who can say that Torah sum naso, that his Torah is his sole occupation. Remember, we learned before that there were some great Amoraim who could not honestly say that Torah sumum nasum, that Torah was their sole occupation. But even though they learned all day.
Do we have people today?
No, not at all. There's no one who can exempt themselves from Kriya Shema today, right? But remember, even Rebbe, who felt that he was exempt from Kriya Shema, there was still a bare minimum that everyone agrees that even that such a scholar has to do, which is to say the first pasuk. Okay. So the Gemara now is going to go further on this story. We had seen in the opinion of Bar Kapara that you have to, at the very minimum, say the first three psukim of Kriya Shema. Shema, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Liolam Vaed, and V'ahavta V'chol Avavcha V'chol Nafshecha V'chol Meodecha. That you have to have kavana for. So it seems the Gemara is equating that idea of needing to have kavana for those three psukim with the bare minimum that Rebbe would have been required to say. Rabbi Tivyumi Sha'al Rebbe Chizkiya Les Hada Amra. Doesn't that story of Rebbe teach us She'ein Lecha Tzarech Kavana Ela Pasuk Rishon Bilvad? That when we require you to have kavana for Kriya Shema, all you need is for the first pasuk, because that's all that Rebbe said. Doesn't that indicate that that's the part that's so necessary and nothing else is necessary? You don't have to say the second and third pasuk. All you need to say is the first pasuk. Okay, so the Gemara answers, Amar lei, no, that's not a good inference, because Ada Yisaneh ad Vishinantam, because it was possible. We don't know exactly what Rebbe was saying when he put his hand over his eyes. It is theoretically possible that he said all three psukim. Okay, so therefore, even though he put his hand over his eyes for a few seconds, it could be that he only said the first pasuk, but it's also possible that he said all three psukim. So you can't infer anything from there. What's interesting is that the Yerushalmi is maintaining its position that we don't paskin like, which is that you need to have kavana. The kavana is ma'akev. It's absolutely necessary. And if you don't have kavana for the first three psukim, you're not Yotze Kriya Shema, and you have to go back and recite it. We hold that that's true only for the first pasuk of Kriya Shema. But the Yerushalmi is not going like that. The Yerushalmi is maintaining the position that it maintained before. So before we go on to the next discussion, which is going to be a discussion of hefsek, of interrupting your Shema, which is going to be problematic. So we should just sort of clarify some of the halachic issues. If you take a look, we're going back to Yud Ches Amud Beis, and you take a look at the second paragraph of footnote 20, he writes, Hatam sheRebbi hiniach yado al einav. The reason why Rebbe placed his hand on his eyes, hu kedei shelo yistakel litzdadim v'tispat el kavanasa. It was in order that Rebbe should not get distracted by things that were within his sights. Okay, umikan hamakor leminhagenu lechasos es ha'einayim be'is kriyas pasuk rishon shel Shema. And this is the source of our custom to place our hand over our eyes when we say the first verse of Kriya Shema. Acherim meforshim, others suggest shekeshekori pasuk zeh umechaven shehashem yachid lamayla ulamatu v'arbaruchos, that you have in mind that God is the singularity that is both above and below and in all four directions. Sorach l'rames be'inav ba'oseis litzdadim elu. You have to be moving your eyes in all those directions. V'lachein kisa Rebbe Espanav kedei shelo yiru hatalmidim es tenuas einav, so that the student should not see the motion. There are people who hold that you have to actually move your face to go up, to go down, and to go all around, to remind yourself, even with the motion of your head, that God is the master over all four directions. So what we'll do is Mirz Hashem will take a look at the Shulchan Aruch tomorrow, and we'll look into this a little bit further. We'll have to hold it here for today. Once again, Chodesh Tov, everyone, and we'll have a regular Lent shir commencing tomorrow. Take care, everybody.